everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the library tonight. My name is Emma and I work at the library. I have two small bits of housekeeping before we get started. I want to remind everybody that the restrooms on this floor are just to the left of the elevator. Looking out here, I know a lot of people don't spend a lot of time on the fourth floor, so that's where those are if you're looking for those. And then second, we have a board meeting tomorrow night at 6 p.m. If anyone is interested in attending that, it's open to the public. And with that, that's all the housekeeping I have. So I'd really like to introduce to you all and ask you to help me welcome Randy Schwartz of the Culinary Historian Society.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you other folks too for being here in person today. We welcome all the folks online too. There's a lot more of them actually watching through the library's YouTube channel. For today's talk on Henry Orr, a Black caterer in early federal Washington. It's the first meeting in our yearly series. We organize these monthly talks from September through May each year, so we're happy to see people back here with us after the summer hiatus. I'm Randy Schwartz with the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Our president, Mariam Breed, is here too in the front corner. I want to also thank our host for today's program, the Ann Arbor District Library, because they provide us with this presentation room as well as promotional and technical support so we can share these programs far and wide by live streaming them and by recording and posting them on the library's YouTube channel. For the new viewers and visitors today, I want to briefly introduce the Culinary Historians. We're an informal group bringing together all sorts of people interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. The group was founded in 1983, and new members are always welcome. We have a little over 150 members currently, about half of them here in Michigan, and the other half across North America and overseas. Besides these monthly talks, we also have twice yearly participatory theme meals for members only, one in the summer and one in late autumn. For example, the next meal coming up is on December 7th on the theme of the Gilded Age. Some of you might have been watching that TV series. We'll be having some fun tasting what the rich and the not so rich were eating in the US in the late 1800s. If you're not a member of CHAA, we'd love to have you join. Our membership is only $25 a year for an individual or a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast. A postal subscription to Repast by itself is only $20 a year, no matter what country you live in. By the way, anyone can write for Repast. Just contact me via the CHAA website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and we'll talk about it. If you'd like to join our group or just subscribe to Repast, you can find the information on that website. Click on the membership tab there. You can also follow us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Or if you're here in person, you can pick up a membership form on the side table after the Q&A session. By the way, for those watching this online via YouTube, if you'd like to ask the speaker a question, you can type it into the chat section and we'll try to convey that question to the speaker. After the Q&A today, for those here in person, we'll have some snacks, some sweet potato buns, freshly baked using a recipe from Mary Randolph's 1824 cookbook, The Virginia Housewife. So help yourselves to those snacks after the program. Our talk next month, Sunday, October 19th, same time, same room. It'll be about spam, not the kind that you find in your email inbox and try to get rid of. It's the kind that you actually eat. We're grateful that an expert in that subject, Dr. Kelly Spring in Washington, D.C., has agreed to dispel for us all of the popular misconceptions about that brand of pork product and its origins. She's fresh from writing a book about it titled Spam, A Global History. So look forward to that exactly 3 weeks from today. And now finally, I want to introduce today's speaker. We're so pleased to connect with Dr. Sorensen today from Indigo House, which is her home and farmstead in Crozet, Virginia, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now an independent scholar, Dr. Sorensen is the retired African-American research historian at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate near Charlottesville. Leni grew up in the Los Angeles area, and long before her career as a farmer, foodways teacher, and historian, she was a singer in an all-female folk group and in the West Coast company of the rock musical Hair. Much, much later, Leni earned her PhD in American Studies at the College of William and Mary, focusing on fugitive slaves in antebellum Richmond, Virginia. In addition to researching and writing about foodways and gardenways in African and African American history, for a quarter century she demonstrated fireplace cookery at museums, farms, and historical sites in the Mid-Atlantic. She was the historical technical consultant for the CBS TV miniseries, The Memoirs of Sally Hemings, in 1999, and research coordinator for the permanent exhibit. Some of you might have seen this at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, for the permanent exhibit, And Still We Rise. She was featured in the TV series High on the Hog on Netflix in 2021, and in this year's series, Finding Edna Lewis on Virginia Public Television. Currently at Indigo House, she teaches cooking and canning classes and organizes sit-down 4-course history dinners. She's also been contributing wonderful articles to our quarterly repast since 2005. So for the last 20 years, she's been writing for. Without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Leni Sorensen.
Good afternoon to you all, and it's just wonderful and an honor to be with you coming here from Virginia. I am just haven't been in Ann Arbor for years, but I remember it with great fondness, and thank you both to the library and to CHAA for inviting me. We're going to talk about Henry Orr. I'm going to start by setting making the setting for his life. This is assuming I find the place. There we go. Now I'm on. Okay. It was early February, 1865, in the young city of Washington. The population was about 33,000 people, and the unpaved roads were rutted and muddy. But winter was the time for Congress to meet, combining politics with visiting and dinners that were common late afternoon activities among the elite residents. The halls of Congress housed some 273 elected officials, and of course, a growing federal bureaucracy to match. In the rituals of entertainment, the president scheduled open invitation levees, where sometimes hundreds of people pressed into what we call the White House, but at that time was known as the President's House. But men like the Secretary of State mostly held his invitation-only evening parties in the genteel privacy of his home. The most socially elite, particularly the wives, often avoided the former, but readily attended the latter. The wives and families of the congressmen mingled with the wives and families of the socially elite in carefully calculated and choreographed rounds of paying calls, attending teas, evenings of playing cards and other games, and of course, dinners. The brand new city had evolved a social hierarchy consisting of the wealthy families of the permanent population who had created a social life kind of combined with the ever rotating series of elected officials. On that February afternoon, Margaret Baird Smith was planning a dinner. Married to the first publisher of the town's first newspaper, the National Intelligencer, Mrs. Smith had lived in the city from its earliest days. She was no young house mistress with little experience in the art of entertaining. Mrs. Smith certainly had dined at the most elegant tables in town over the years. Her accounts of dining at Monticello at the Jefferson table offer us some of the few menus we have for meals served there. Her writings, she wrote novels, chronicle the manners and customs of Washington society from an insider's view. Her observation on the roles of women in what was more than any other city, American city, a city with an out of proportion number of eligible gentlemen. And her observations are quite clear-sighted. She says, "The city is thronged with strangers, fashionable ladies from all quarters, a great many mothers with daughters to show off, a great many young ladies coming to see relatives and to be seen by the public." The city was caught in the swirl of nationally evolving opinions on gentility, equality, etiquette, and standards for entry into polite society. Standards that were being debated by the gentry and would-be gentry throughout the country. Margaret Baird Smith was part of that discussion in her private musings, her personal letters, and particularly in her novel, What is Gentility? A Moral Tale, published in 1828. Given a large enough income, quote, she says, the clothing, housings, and furnishings of the gentility could be purchased. Attendance at private schools could supply, quote, book learning and offered lessons in the polite accomplishments of music, dancing, art, and foreign languages, unquote. They were particularly beneficial to the children of the up-and-comers. Mrs. Smith's rather skeptical view was to encourage parents who now lavish their hard-earned wealth on dress and equipage to devote it to the mental improvement of their children instead. The culture wars extended down to such fine details as how one manipulated food into one's mouth. Travelers from abroad in the late 1820s often remarked upon the continuing American habit of knife eating. It wasn't that the 3 or 4-tine fork had not been invented, it was that they were expensive and mostly appeared in the inventories of the wealthy. The 1801 inventory of the White House included 18 French forks. In 1828, an Englishwoman, Mrs. Hall, writing about her experience in the Catskills resorts, noted, quote, "Silver forks, a luxury not to be met with at the best inns in this country." Note she makes a distinction between a resort and a common inn. She continues her letter by noting, quote, that English persons who thought they would not miss a luxury like a 3-pronged fork, 2-pronged being all that we are indulged with within this uncivilized country, would be surprised. She deplored the universal habit of eating with knives. Her husband concurred and noticed that I'm going to find my thing here, and noticed that peas and rice dropped between the tines when he tried to lift them in his usual way. Of course, with a 2-tine fork, that would be not unusual. In his English world, only, quote, the lowest vulgar, as he referred to them, still ate with knives. However, a lot of people still ate with knives, and you see here the standard one. And you see a poem which is actually I learned from my grandfather, who was born in 1870 in Texas. I eat my peas with honey, and I've done so all my life, and it makes the peas taste funny, but it keeps them on the knife. And probably a lot of people have heard that poem. Some critics deplored the money spent on forks and other expensive utensils by the politicians and officials as anti-democratic. One anonymous writer feared the well-earned glory of the new nation would be struck to death with four-pronged forks. As late as 1838, the wife of a Harvard professor was justifying the American style of eating by describing it as a matter of national identity rather than one of gentility. She wrote, quote, "If you wish to imitate the French or English, you will put every mouthful into your mouth with a fork. But if you think, as I do, that Americans have as good a right to their own fashions as the inhabitants of any other countries, you may choose the convenience of feeding yourself with your right hand, armed with a steel blade, and provided you do it neatly and do not put in large mouthfuls or close your lips tightly over the blade, you ought not to be considered as eating ungenteelly." Now, over her years as a hostess, Mrs. Smith's entertaining focused on a small and intimate style of presentation, and were often held at her country home. But there were elegant spurges at times. In 1817, she and her husband had occasion to host a party for 170 guests at their Washington home. A feat which involved not only accepting the use of her friend Mrs. Barlow's servants and everything in her house which could add to the elegance of the party, but also the rental of party equipment. And here you see, for people who didn't entertain on a large scale, they depended on the generosity of friends and the use of professionals to make it possible. And Mrs. Smith was paired. You see in this slide that this man is quite willing to supply on Pennsylvania Avenue cakes and sugar plums and candies and cordials and preserves and fruits and wines and spirits and syrups. And depending on what the needs you had for your dinner, you could get them from him. So Mrs. Smith was prepared and knew exactly who she intended inviting to her table, and she knew exactly who would create the meal. Her dinner was to be in honor of the English writer and abolitionist Harriet Martineau, who was visiting the South to, among other things, view slavery at first hand. Just months before her visit to Washington, upon landing in Boston, she had dared to speak at Boston's female branch of the American Anti-Slavery Society as angry protesters stoned the building, running her out. Now, here in a city where slavery is present at every turn, in the hours before and during the dinner, Ms. Martineau seems to have chosen less controversial topics as part of her conversation. The next day after the dinner, actually, the two women took a pleasant carriage ride to see some local panoramic views. Now, while on the carriage ride, Smith inquired about Martineau's literary career and the resultant fame Ms. Martineau had achieved. Smith wondered, if praise and celebrity, like everything else, do not lose their relish? Martineau demurred from any reputation of fame and notoriety, even when Smith asked about the lionizing of celebrated people. Well, said Martineau, laughing, I have escaped that. To my knowledge, I have never been made a show of or run after as a lion. Of course, writes Miss Smith Riley, I did not deceive her. Something that particularly intrigued Mrs. Smith was Martineau's casual use of the phrase, since I have been employed by government. Certainly that was a perplexing phrase to an American upper-class woman such as Mrs. Smith, for whom employment in almost any public sphere, except the literary, was for all practical purposes verboten. Martineau explained that since the publication of her research and writing on the poor laws and taxation, she had been essentially hired as a consultant by Lord Brougham and Lord Durham. She'd even moved to London so she could meet regularly with members of the cabinet and leaders of the Whig Party. Of Smith's local circle, her longtime close friend, Martha Jefferson Randolph, would be there with her daughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge. Smith had known Jefferson's daughter for over 30 years and watched Ellen grow, as she described, into a lovely and elegant woman. Rounding out the guest list would be Martineau's traveling companion, Miss Jeffrey, Smith's husband, their grown son, and their grandson. And all this fulsome gossip on her doings was contained in a long letter Mrs. Smith wrote to her sister a few days after the dinner, while the details were fresh in her mind. The company was to be small and select. To make sure they had the most genteel and agreeable of meals, Mrs. Smith surely had ideas on how the table would look to her guests. There were many rules about the correct presentation of food upon the table. And here we kind of see a very fancy spread meant to be presented late in an evening of dancing. And you'll note the balance of dishes on the table, rabbit at the head and the foot, and the fricassees to the interior, head and foot, with boiled chicken on either side, and kind of similar dishes placed appropriately around the table. And the sweets were then placed on the corners. So that seems to be that arrangement. And just, you can imagine the long days of planning and preparation that had to go into work for the cooks and the caterers and the local provisioners. In addition, we can't forget the knowledge and experience of butlers, dining room servants, and the house mistress herself when it came to creating a beautiful table. Here's a small table meant for a small winter table and summer table. And you can see the contrast of the seasonal varieties of what would be available. Seasonality of the produce determined careful thought for creating dishes with contrasting sweet, tart, creamy, crunchy, and a bit of savory. And so, to organize and serve Mrs. Smith's meal, she would hire Henry Orr. He was considered by the elite gentry households to be the most experienced and fashionable waiter in the city, end quote. At that time, the meaning of the words waiter and caterer overlapped, so Orr would be expected to not only cook specific dishes and to supervise Mrs. Smith's cook for other dishes, but also be in charge of purchasing dishes from outside vendors and to serve at the table as well. Smith's almost amused description of her interaction with Henry Orr only hints at his extraordinary personal journey as a husband, father, enslaved man, freedman, and skilled chef. His story is one combining culinary excellence with the continuing pernicious demands of American slavery. Mrs. Smith's letter continued, I sent for Henry Orr, whom I had always employed when I had company. He is almost white, his manners gentle, serious, and respectful to an uncommon degree, and his whole appearance quite gentlemanly, as you can imagine. In her usual warm writing style, Smith does not merely list the menu, but creates a detailed picture of her exchange with Orr, the plans for all the food preparation, the guests to be entertained, and whom among her servants would aid Orr in his work. As with any negotiation between a caterer and a hostess, up to the modern day, some of you may have had this experience. The hostess expresses the desire for, quote, the best and most fashionable, yet when faced with the caterer's professional vision and zeal, and of course the cost, the hostess retreats to a more modest plan, often having to endure the professional's scorn. It was no different for Mrs. Smith and Henry Orr. She says, "You must tell me what dishes will be best. Bouilli, I suppose, is not out of fashion." And he replies, "No, indeed, ma'am. A bouilli at the foot of the table is indispensable. There's no dinner without it." A bouilli is essentially a braised beef brisket that, when tender, is further roasted until browned on top and served with vegetables simmered in the rich beef broth. It seems to have been considered the soup course for this meal. And he continues, "After the soup, ma'am, boiled fish, boiled fish, and after the fish, canvasbacks, the bouilli to be removed, and then pheasants." Canvasbacks were a type of wild duck harvested in the Chesapeake Bay and widely liked. Stop, Henry, she tells us. "Not so many removes, if you please." And he says, "Why, ma'am, you said your company was to be a dozen, and I'm only telling you what is absolutely necessary." In fact, the final number from Mrs. Smith turned out to be about 8 people. It turns out that just the day before Orr and Smith conferred on the menu for her planned dinner, he had created and served a dinner given for Martineau by Mr. and Mrs. Woodbury. Orr stressed that it had been a meal attended by 18 people, to whom 30 dishes of meat were served. Smith protests, "But Henry, I am not a secretary's lady. I want a small, genteel dinner." "Well, indeed, ma'am, that's all I'm telling you. For side dishes, you will have a very small ham, a small turkey, on either side of them, partridges, mutton chops, or sweetbreads, a macaroni pie, an oyster pie." And she says, "Oh, that'll do. Okay, Henry, that's now for the vegetables." He says, "Well, ma'am, stewed celery, spinach, salsify, cauliflower." And she says, "Henry, you must substitute potatoes, beets, things like that." He says, "Well, ma'am, they will not be genteel. But to be sure, if you say so, it must be." Mrs. Forsythe the other day would have a plum pudding because she keeps to old fashions. Did you notice that all the vegetables named, including the fancier ones, or suggest, are all late fall and winter vegetables that could be stored in root cellars? And this exchange is a good reminder of how even the menus of the wealthy were bound by the seasons, even with a long growing season in the Tidewater area of Virginia. Finally, the two came to an agreement of 8 meat dishes with an array of vegetables and desserts. The desserts were to be chosen from jellies, custards, cakes, sweetmeats, and sugar plums, because puddings and pies were also out of current fashion. In addition, Smith was startled to learn that nuts and raisins and figs as part of the dessert course were no longer fashionable. Indeed, Henry states, "Oh, no, ma'am," he says, "they are quite vulgar." When we study the world of elite cuisine in the 19th century, in the South, just focusing on the food itself leaves out the importance of that arbiter of culinary taste, the waiter, caterer, cook, chef. These men might be enslaved or recently freed, but they were savvy, often urban. They were professionals aware of the nuances of the political and social world in which they moved and worked every day. Just as a lady's maid had to be alert to current fashions in women's dresses and hats and fans and cloaks, and a gentleman's valet vigilantly up to date on the proper tie of the neckcloth. One etching in the fashion press demonstrated over 20 ways to tie a neckcloth. And the most fashionable trousers and boots, so too with the dining room waiter and chef. His job was to know what was fashionable at the table, who had served what in the last week, and even what was spoken at the table. And of course, he had to know with whom it was safe to share this hard-won information. While serving at the Woodburys the day before, Henry Orr was not only judging the reception of fashionable table service and dishes, but overhearing the dining table gossip. Thus, his multiple skills, plus his discretion, could make or break one's dining reputation. To my delight, and apparently hers as well, Orr felt easy enough to share with Smith not only what Miss Martineau had eaten, but the content of what seems to have been an animated political conversation Martineau had with the Secretary of State, Henry Clay, over the meal. Henry reported, quote, "I took particular notice of what she ate, so that I might know another time what to hand her. For she dines everywhere, ma'am, and I see her taste is very simple. She ate nothing but a little turkey and a mite of ham. Nothing else, ma'am." Smith continues to quote Orr by including his words of praise for Henry Clay. Quote, "I consider Mr. Clay the greatest and best man now living, and sure I should know, for I served him long enough, and it was but proper, ma'am, that the greatest man should show attention to the greatest lady." From Henry's words in praise of Secretary Clay, it seems that at some point in the past, he had been in Clay's service and certainly felt free to express to Smith his great admiration for this man. Now, in whose kitchens did Henry gain his culinary knowledge? The several men who owned Henry Orr over the years must have apprenticed him as a young man to chefs within their own kitchens and perhaps in other people's kitchens, prominent kitchens in the city. My research on that part of Orr's life is ongoing here to see if I can find more records. However it was obtained, on that foundation of experience, Orr built his professional reputation. White families who hired or owned good cooks knew what a valuable asset they could be to genteel presentation. Orr certainly would have been aware of the high costs of buying an enslaved cook in that era. Enslaved cooks who had trained and worked for long years in kitchens, such as those in Washington City and surrounding plantations, were seen as highly valuable commodities. On the slave market, cooks always brought good prices to their former masters. At one large estate sale in 1849, one family decided to retain their cook rather than sell her, even though, quote, "if she'd been set up at public sale, she would have brought $1,500. She's a fine cook, and there were a great many wealthy gentlemen wanting her." Now, many cooks began their life of work as scullions, moving up through the kitchen hierarchy. Kitchen work would be divided among a number of women, as indicated in a letter that Harriet Pinckney Horry, daughter of Eliza Lucas Pinckney of South Carolina, wrote to her mother in the 1770s, describing the arrangements in her home. Quote, "Mary Ann was the cook and understands roasting poultry in the greatest perfection you ever saw." And of course, expertly tied securely to the spit and rotated in front of a bank of glowing coals. Roasting beef and lamb and fowl was an art at this time. Marianne also made the punch from a sangaree, which was red wine and citron juices and brandy or rum. From a syllabub, a frothy syllabub made of white wine and lemon juice and sugar and Madeira. That was a punch that was really the cocktail of choice, and it'll put you down. I made some, and it's quite marvelous. To be put in charge of the punch meant one had a deft hand and was trustworthy with the alcohol, which was the house mistress was concerned with. I think such experts are called mixologists today, and Marianne would have served that role. Daphne, the undercook, baked bread and served and cooked, that she may not forget what she learned at Santee, which was the plantation upriver from where she was currently cooking. And here we see the apprenticeship hierarchy in operation. Old Ebba, and we don't know her age, fattened the poultry to a nicety. At that time, the word nice meant picky and precise. So old Ebba was clearly skilled at feeding, butchering, plucking, and presenting a perfect bird to the cook. Young Ebba, and here again we know her relationship, old Ebba, she might have been a daughter, a granddaughter, or a namesake, was the scullion. She fetched wood in, ashes out, water in, slops out, and scoured all the pots and pans. She was to learn as much as she could of cooking and washing, because those were occupations that hopefully she could advance to. Along with the many skills of cooking, washing took many skills as well. It involved making good soap and boiling and pounding linens and the tedious task of ironing. Building on skill and reputation, Henry Orr created fine dining for elite white families of Washington City for most of 30 years. In the doing, he earned enough money to buy himself. And this is his freedom paper. I continue my ongoing research into Henry's former owners, William Ramsey of the Navy and Benjamin Lear, an obviously interested sponsor, because that's who co-signed on this loan. Equally as important is to trace as far as possible Orr's parentage, because Mrs. Smith describes him as almost white. This means Orr had been born into that ever so complicated morass surrounding the lives of mixed race enslaved people. The $500 was loaned in December of 1823 when Orr was 29 years old, and almost exactly 2 years later, he paid that money back, earning his legal freedom. Now, he was nothing if not persistent in his goals. Within 4 years, he first purchased and then manumitted his 3 young boys, the oldest of whom must have been a baby when Orr first began the arduous task of working toward his own freedom. Shortly after the freedom of his boys, Orr paid for the manumission of his wife, Sarah Pankins. And a few years before his death, he paid to manumit his oldest daughter, Sarah. She seemed to have been named after her mother. And the youngest daughter, Rebecca, remained legally enslaved to her father until his death in 1846, when she was freed by his will at age 14. It seems that she continued to live at home under the care of her mother and was still living in her sister's household at age 24 in 1859, when she registered a certificate of freedom. 14 years after Orr's death, his 51-year-old daughter, Sarah Orr, was listed as a seamstress, quote, owning real property valued at $1,500 in the 1860 census. Orr's ambitions for his children seem to have been well worth all his considerable and loving efforts. Over the years, the purchases, including manumissions, came to a total of $833. In addition, upon his death, Henry left an estate to his wife of $50 in silver. My ongoing list of research questions about Henry Orr is long, but first and foremost is in how many Washington kitchens and dining rooms must Orr have labored to earn this stunning equivalent of $222,000 in today's currency that it took to emancipate himself and his family. So this is the man Mrs. Smith knew would offer the very best dining experience for her special guests. It seems she chose wisely. The District of Columbia Free Negro registers record Orr's deep sense of obligation to his family. And as you have seen in the documentation, what we do have is astounding to read. There can be no doubt that Henry Orr was an extraordinarily motivated man. He may have been mild-mannered, polite, and differential by all the required rules of antebellum racial etiquette, but clearly he didn't hesitate to speak his mind when his professional expertise was challenged. In closing, let's remember his firm response to those passé nuts and raisins. "Oh no, ma'am, they are quite vulgar." Thank you. I'll be glad to take questions if you have any.
For the benefit of the online audience, if you could be sure to speak into the microphone, or those online people won't be able to hear the question.
Thank you, Dr. Sorensen. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, one thing that I found very interesting was that Henry Orr owned his children. Was this a common practice?
Yes, because often when you see listings of Black people who have been freed and they then own their family members, it is their family members because in places like Virginia and other southern states, once you were freed, you had to leave the state within a year. So a person who was freed many times got, depending on their jobs and what kind of status they had or what kind of sponsor they might have, they might get permission to stay within the state. Virginia, there's examples in Virginia, but certainly within Washington, D.C. And so he needed to own his family because otherwise they would have to leave the state once they were freed in a year. And this is why, say, turning to Monticello in 1837 and in 1836 when they had the auction and Edith Fawcett, the cook, was sold, her husband, who was freed by the House of the General Assembly, moved to Charlottesville, and he then had to earn the money to buy her. And then in 1837, once he had bought her and several of their children, with the help of relatives and other people in the Charlottesville area to find the funds, he then takes her to the county courthouse and he formally frees her. And that's why we have a description, because they're describing people who have been freed, manumitted for their paper, that have the freedom paper. And so then almost immediately after that, they move to Ohio, where they can be free altogether. But that makes the ownership of slaves by Black people very complicated. This is not to say that there were not Black plantation owners, or in one case, a wheelmaker that I know of who bought slaves to use as labor. There are in some instances, but the majority of them are people who are buying the freedom, who are buying their own family members, which they then hope at some point to be able to free, but in the meantime, they have to hold them. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Sorensen. I have another question that's also about either laws or customs of slavery that I don't know much about. So if Henry Orr purchased his freedom with money he made as a caterer, was it the law or the choice of his enslaver that when he worked as a caterer, he was allowed to keep either all or some fraction of the money?
Yes, he hired himself, when he was enslaved, he probably hired himself out, or technically hired himself out, and the monies for his hiring would go to his owner. And that's, how hiring worked. He obviously was in a good enough position and had a relationship with his owners that they would allow him essentially, they would loan him the money to pay off. And I'm never quite sure of all of the permutations of it, to buy himself. And then he paid the loan back. So I get the feeling that he borrowed the money from someone who was not his owner to pay the owner. And sometimes that could happen. There's a lot of permutations. And the problem, when you think of it, the owner always had the arbitrary ability to just keep the money and not do the papers, because the owner had absolute and total right. In 1826, the North Carolina Supreme Court Judge Ruffin found the power of the master must be absolute so as to render the submission of the slave perfect. In which case, and it's reiterated in a number of General Assembly pronouncements over the years, the master had absolute control and could do anything, had the arbitrary ability to do anything they wished. And so it really did depend so often on these complex interpersonal relationships. We think of times when men had Black concubines with whom they had children and whom they left in their will the desire to free the woman and the children. Well, the family did not have to abide by that, and many, maybe even most times, did not abide by that. So, the master had absolute control, and that was, the situation. Or must have been, one gets the feeling, an extremely diplomatic, personable, a man who could just read the room, as it were, and really know how to negotiate these shoals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leni. You spoke about a sort of apprentice hierarchy within the kitchen, and I'm wondering if the knowledge was passed along purely orally and by, practice, cooking experience? Or were there also, did you find evidence of written records in that situation, like cooking journals and cookbooks being used to record the state of the art?
Well, as we see from the incredible collection that Tony Tipton Martin has made of historic Black cookbooks, or historic Black chefs that are represented in cookbooks, obviously early in the early 19th century, there were very few being written down. This does not mean, however, that cooks were necessarily unable to read. And there were other books that the house mistress had. She would have had Amelia Simmons. She could have had a little later, Mary Randolph. She could have had earlier editions, Hannah Glass, in her own library of cookbooks. It's because it was illegal to teach the enslaved to read and write after, I believe, it's 1804 in Virginia. The knowledge of that people could read or write was kept very close to the chest within families. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that nobody was literate. It just means we don't know about it. Cinder Stanton, in some of her work at Monticello, reached a conclusion that really kind of a considerable minority of people actually were at least functionally literate. So there's, housewives, when they had a menu, when they had a menu that they were going to work with the cook to do for the week, all the jobs that needed to be done. And it was not just like a specific menu for every day, but the jobs that had to be done that were going to be for months later, collecting the raspberries to make the raspberry cordial that you might have in December, but you're going to pick the raspberries in June, that kind of thing. These are deeply agricultural people. They knew the flow of seasons. They had cooked, especially at the starting at the apprentice level. They they were passing on all of this information, because to be able to have a daughter or a cousin or someone within your family come into the kitchen rather than, say, some kind of brutal field work was really to bring parts of one's family forward in a way. But also, I bet, and I know a lot of people use cookbooks, and we all love them, and I own, shelves full of them. But if I had to cook, once you have a body of experience, once you've cooked for a few years, especially for a family, if you didn't have a cookbook, you could figure out what to cook. You'd know a lot of stuff that you might not think you really knew, but you'd remember it. You might not do a lot of cakes, and that's what those recipe books often had. Cake after cake after cake, because those are harder to make and they take more precision. But your basic, roasting and cooking and small dishes and vegetable preparations, you just don't have to, it is not necessary to have a specific recipe for that. So cooks taught the second cook, and the second cook guided the scullion, and the scullion learned what she could, and everybody advanced and taught each other, because people who were interested in food, and they had to have an interest in food because they kept doing, they did this every single day, these meals. It wasn't like, the meal that Orr said he did for the Woodburys with the 18-course meats. In many places, that was common every single day, 365 at, somewhere between 2 and 5, there was this elaborate meal that had been cooked. These people had incredible experience. And so we don't find much documentation, which is why I so cherish the Harriet Horry 1770 description of the women in her kitchen and what they were doing. It's very rare to find that, but it gave us an opening to really look at how that hierarchy might work. And I would say we would see that replicated in various ways across the plantation South between cooks. And once emancipation happens and people are free to learn to read and write and to buy a recipe book, and we see it in the work of Melinda Russell, they're collecting recipes, they're teaching each other recipes, they're sharing each other, they're sharing recipes, and they're using the skills that have been accumulated over the previous many decades to create their own entrepreneurial work, even in domestic private homes, to hotels, to many kinds of settings.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the chat?
There are a few questions from the chat. Mark asks, what additional history did you glean about the extraordinary person who bought ore solely for the purpose that ore could pay him back and thus earn his freedom?
The man, Mr. Lear, that loaned him the money. We don't know that relationship. I'm going to have to do some digging to see who this Mr. Lear was. I said that he was in the Navy, but I'm not sure, I don't yet know exactly. To find out, what had he cooked in Lear's kitchen? How was he recommended? How was his, what would you say, his trustworthiness that he would pay this money back? By this time, he already, had at least a decade or more of work, at least, behind him as a professional person. So Mr. Lear must have, felt, okay, he's good for it. And I want to free him, but I don't know Mr. Lear's politics, or, it's awful early in terms of abolition. There's not really a lot of, active, because there's not really a vision at that point, that there's not really a sense that in a very short time, several decades, there's going to be a general emancipation. So I'm not sure it's hard to suss out people's motives so far back. If I ever found his papers, I will be glad, and I will come back on and I will let you know, because I will be thrilled to know if he made any kind of remarks at all.
Thank you. We also have a question from Martin in the chat. He asks, what are your first steps when looking into the lives of these enslaved cooks? And what are some of your favorite resources that someone in the general public can use to find out more about them?
Well, there's kind of standard, it's looking in plantation records, which sometimes lists the names of cooks, or other times they don't give a name for a cook, you just know they had one. So then if there's a housekeeping book that tells you what kind of meals they may have had, what kind of menus, you can then suss out what the cook had to know. So you can use that as a place to start. The documentation is sparse. Even when you get to Monticello, we have, the bread and rations lists that Jefferson's handing out to the community. We have a list of foodstuffs that we know the community were growing in their gardens and selling into the Jefferson economy. We have a housekeeping book that gives a number of recipes and even mentions the name James Hemming, so we know that he's listed. That he at some point he is part of what they consider to be the legacy. But basically, the people that ate at the table, they didn't give it, pardon the expression, they didn't give a damn about the cooks. They didn't care. Remember, they held these people in slavery. They just wanted the food to appear at the table. Jefferson never writes about the food. He never says, "Oh, that was a fantastic meal." We have very few descriptions of the meals at the White House. Luckily, they're from other people who came in and visited and ate at, and ate at Jefferson's table. But Jefferson himself is not, really going on and on about the food or the cooks. He just wants that when he walks into his dining room and the dinner is served, that it meets certain, that it meets certain criteria. And his daughter makes sure that that happens. And other than that, they don't have to pay attention to the cook. And they don't. Because the cooks aren't even people. Remember, they're three-quarter people. They're just not part of the discussion. And I know we always want to kind of look to see if we can dig down and find, and I just keep digging and digging, and I'm often, all I have is a list of the food that was cooked. So what I use in answer to that dearth of information is, that's why I love Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife, because she was a house mistress for 3 decades in a place of where slavery was the common rule, and she used enslaved cooks in her kitchens, and she used and had with her husband enslaved men and women that worked on her plantations. And so these these dishes, when I look at them and read carefully the recipe, one can look at it and know what the cook had to know. Because she wasn't spending all her time in the kitchen directing somebody who didn't know how to cook. She was the mistress of the house, taking care of all of that stuff and appearing at the table and making sure that the table was presented beautifully and appropriately for her class. And she had to trust that the cook knew what she was doing, or that knew what he was doing. And that there might, they had to commune how they did, what form the conversations took place, we don't really know. But they had to communicate with the cook and other providers to make sure that there were enough provisions in the house to meet all those needs. But the cooking itself, the actual preparation, how a dish is prepared, that was done, with the mind and the hands of the cook, because they had to know how to do it. And they knew how to start early in the morning and work through, and they knew what time dinner was going to be served. And so there's a lot of, choreography and timing and organizing the work in the kitchen to make sure that it all happened. And along with the fact that Jefferson didn't comment about the food, but he also didn't criticize that somehow the food was late. Dinner was an hour late, or the cook was drunk, or any of those things. Just meal after meal after meal. So I use the recipes, particularly Mary Randolph's recipes, because she has very detailed recipes, to get a handle on what do you have to know to do that? What has to come first? If you're going to do a Virginia ham, well, then you have to have a ham. And who butchered the animal, and where was it stored, and who salted it, and who did that? If you have asparagus, who grew it, who picked it, when was it done in the morning? You can start peopling these recipes with skills, with the people who did it and what they had to know to do it. There's a couple of housekeeping books. Martha Wales Jefferson kept a housekeeping book, and one time in 1776, she puts in her book, killed 15 hogs. Now, almost all of us, you know what I mean, have no idea. The idea of butchering 15 hogs over probably the coldest part of January is an incredible task. And she lists what the products are of it, the the pounds of lard and the pounds of soap and that was made from the lard and the hams and all. She's in charge of the inventory of what resulted from those 15 hogs. But when we look at then what does it take to butcher 15 hogs, that's when we start really, if we have any sense of how this stuff works, and it's important, I think, as cooks and as historians, to really delve into that, to really know what that means, so we don't just kind of let that phrase blow off as if it didn't represent really difficult work over probably a week and a half by scores of people who were very skilled and already knew how to do these things because they'd been doing it every year for years and years. You know, those are our sources. Those are my sources, let's put it that way. I would always hope if anyone has other wonderful sources, let me know, because I'm always learning myself.
Thank you. That's all the chat questions we have. Did anybody else have a question?
Thank you. I was wondering, were caterers like Henry Orr hired in like a traditional job these days, or did they have to be enslaved in order to work for someone?
Oh no, they would be freedmen. You know, once he bought his freedom, he continued to work as a caterer. It's the term at the time was kind of a combination of caterer, waiter, and I think between the client and the person, they decided, are you just going to provide all the food and my servants will serve, or are you going to provide the food and also serve, as we see Henry Orr doing in this particular case? You didn't have to be, you know, there were places where there were freedmen, and Washington, D.C. was one, and that followed many occupations. Then you would have had, again, in the confectioner that I showed the slide of the confectioner, he undoubtedly had Black people in his kitchens helping, learning to and then doing, and maybe some were enslaved and maybe some were hired and maybe some were, you know, were free and just hired to make confections. That's how people learned. You know, there was no kind of set rule of how it had to be. There was just these rules of hierarchy of who, you know, what place you were, and then how you maintained that. But you were everybody was apprenticing. That's how you learned to do whatever it is that you were doing. I hope that makes sense. And if not, if I didn't approach it, let me know.
Thank you, Dr. Sorensen. One thing I saw in the image that you're presenting is the attire of the cook. It seems very professional. So my question is this like similar throughout all households and throughout all roles in the kitchen, or is there variations?
Cooks were part of the visible the visible evidence of having an enslaved staff. Even though people didn't see them often, they were in the house precinct. They were going in and out of the kitchens and coming in and out of the service areas. And so coachmen and yard people and certainly domestic servants, meaning those people who worked in the house itself and would be visible to visitors without wearing uniforms, although George Washington kind of had he liked the idea of livery. I'm not sure how far he was able to carry it, but he did like that idea. But would have been dressed in presentable enough attire that they were acceptable within the house precinct. So we see a man here in this image He has a vest. This is common for everybody wearing, man's attire were, vests and a shirt and trousers. He's clearly wearing an apron that looks to me was tied at the waist. He would have been presentable. He could have, changed his apron if it got messy, and but he's not going to get called into the dining room to be applauded. Hello, for let's hear it for the chef. Nothing like that. But he would be visible when visitors walked through the area, walked through the plantation, where they were free. The visitors that were coming to the home. They were free to walk, anywhere and interact with whoever they wanted to interact with. And so in that setting, those servitors almost always had somewhat better clothing, a little better fabric, or a little more variety, or got dispensed fabric more often, rather than once a year, maybe twice a year, because they needed to appear, relatively dignified. I mean, that's the nature of that. When, people say, well, house servants were always dressed better. Well, of course, because they interacted with all the visitors, and you wanted, owners wanted their servants to look respectable. Unless they were going to actually wear uniforms, which does not appear to be the case. That most, like I say, I think George Washington toyed with the idea of livery, but I don't know how much of it he actually did.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Help yourselves to some snacks and talk with us about maybe joining the CHAA. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate being with you.